They're here, everyone. They are the smart kids at the shops with their mothers or fathers, riding their bikes around the streets and playing down by the river, as well as talking to their friends on their smartphones. Join the smart kids each week as they discover, explore, and solve the mysteries of today. Here's your host, JT Crowley.
Last week, I talked to you about sub-characters and floating characters. And I said to you then that concludes what I was going to talk to you about, the characters, and I'm going to move on to the plot. So here we are, because the plot is very, very important in the story, because it is the story, basically. So, lesson 3, the plot. But I hope you found the formulas that I use for the characters very useful. And so if you've got any questions, contact me. Right, so for me, the plot, the first thing I do is I separate the plot into 2 categories, 2 sections. Section 1 is the scenery, and that's what I'm going to cover off today. Section 2 is the storyline itself. That I will cover off next week. But I just want to concentrate on the first section, the scenery. So this week, let's have a look at the scenery. And why is that important? And you'll see why. So the scenery. Again, I break that down into 2 sections. Country, and then region area, town, village, etc. And what I do is, the first part of that is the country, and that's what I concentrate on to start with. Because when you've got to your story, it's got to be based somewhere. And you've got to get your facts right, you've got to get your information right, otherwise your credibility with your readers isn't going to stack, isn't going to add up. And you'll lose your respect with your readers, and that's what you need to avoid. So, under the section country, so you're going to decide which country am I going to put my character. And so you've got to decide, so when you've decided which country, then you've got to go and have a look to see what the topography is like in that country. And you'll see why in a minute. And you've got to go and have a look at the culture and the people of that country. And you also need to have a look at the weather that that country has. And also, what time of the year is your story set? And again, really important is what era is your storyline set? What year is your storyline set in? So these are very important facts for you to consider. And then, once you've decided this, and you've had a look at the topography, the terrain, how the land lies, because when you do your descriptions and you describe something, well, it's got to be true to that country. Or if you are describing the people or the cultures of that country, it's got to be true. Because different cultures, different people have different habits, different styles, do things differently. And you've got to be correct, you've got to be right. And the weather, no point in saying it's boiling hot, yes, and you've got your character in Greenland, and it's freezing cold. And the time of the year is also very important, as well as what era you're writing your story in. The other section here, I've broke it down to region, I've broken it down to town, village, etc. And this is where you can go on and talk about where in that area, in that region, have you put that character? What town, what village, what city, where? And what is that city about? What does it look like? What are the streets like? What are the houses like? What are the schools like? What are the cafes like? And that's what you need to go and research and do. And it's a lot easier if you've been there, obviously, because you can then record your own experiences, your own knowledge. But if you haven't been there, you need to do a lot more research. So let's go down a bit further and let's have a little look, shall we? Okay. Country. Right. If you know the country, because you've been there or it's all well and good, then you can draw on your own experiences and your knowledge of the place. But what you will also need to do is then still go on to do your research, go onto the internet to have a look at the research of the country, have a look at the history, the culture, all about it, because when you've been there, you won't pick up anything there. So go and do your research and go on Google Earth and have a look at the place, have a look at the pictures, have a look at the area, get a feel for the area. That's what's very, very important. If you've never been to visit the place where you've put your plot, then you're going to have to do a lot more research than if you've been. So you need to go online, have a look at the places, go on Google Earth or any other map app that will take you into that place, for satellite images, and have a look at the roads, look at the 3D images, the lands, what's it like? You need to do that, because when you go into your story and you're doing your description of the area, you need to be accurate. No point in saying, you're in north of Norway, and you said, the deserts were very hot and the sand was blowing. It's not right. It's going to affect your credibility. So you need to be accurate. You need to do your research. And when you find any author that writes a book, they do an awful lot of research first. So let's have a look. So you need to look at the topography, the lay of the land. Is it mountainous? Is it flat? Is it jungle? Is it a desert? Are there glaciers there? Are there volcanoes there? That's all important. Equally, is your country in the northern hemisphere or in the southern hemisphere? Again, that's important. So if the country, say, like Nepal, that's where you put your plots, your character, that's where they come from, that's what you're writing about, or Tibet, which are, generally speaking, mountainous countries, then saying or talking about jungles or deserts will probably not be appropriate. And your reader will think you've not done your research. They'll be right, and they'll spot that and pick that up with you. So you need to do your research properly, and otherwise you're just going to lose all credibility. Am I getting that message across? It's important, really, really important. Let's have a look at other little areas that I use the formulas for. Okay. So to look at the lay of the land, I use Google Earth to get a feel for the place. If I've been to that country, then I draw on my own experiences and the knowledge of being. I can recall the streets, the history, the background, the culture, the images. I can recall all that. But I still go onto Google Earth and go and refresh my memory and have a look and just back up what I originally saw and thought. Google Earth is a fantastic app, like any other map app. You can go down the streets, you can go anywhere, you can go into the places, into this, the houses, have a look. It's really, really important, and it's absolutely fun having a look as well. It gives you a feel. So it'll give you, if you come across in your storyline, say, you've done your research, you have been thorough in your storyline, and the reader will respect that. So, moving on from topography, culture, and people. So, you need to go onto the internet and research the many cultures of the people that live in that area where you put your story, where you plot it. That's important. because different countries have got different cultures, different backgrounds, different ethnicity. And to put a character in a particular country and then you refer to a different culture, it's not going to stack, it's not going to add up, and it's not going to do you any justice. So, again, make sure the character's attributes match here. Otherwise, the plot and the characters are going to be at odds, and your reader will pick that up and you won't look professional. No point in saying you are in the Andes and your character is up the mountains and they're wearing that, and you then say, your character was a tall, white person with brown hair or blonde hair. That's not going to fit, because the characteristics of the Peruvian people, they are dark-skinned, they've got dark hair, black hair, they are shortish, they're plumpish. So, do you see why you need to do all your research? Because if you say something different, it's not going to stack, it's not going to look very good. And you also need to look at the country's weather. So if you're going to say, so the countries, let's say, so time of the year is where's the plot set in? Is it a hot country? Is it a cold country? Is it a wet, rainy country? And what era is your story in? That's important as well, and I'll say why in a minute. So, if your story is set in Greenland, say for example, and you describe the weather as it was a hot summer's day and the temperature outside was 50 degrees, that never happens. It's not realistic. And your reader's going to pick up on that and go, really? I don't think they've been to Greenland, and I don't think they've researched it. Because you're not going to get 50 degrees heat in their summer, more likely 4 or 5. And it's not going to be a hot summer's day. It'll be a cool summer's day with a temperature around about outside of 4 to 5 degrees. So do you see how important the weather is? And if it's a dry country, so you've got your character in Saudi Arabia, you say, it's incessantly raining all the time. No, they'd be very lucky to get some rain. So you need to be careful about where you put your character. So the weather is important. The topography is important. The culture and the people, your research is all important, because your reader will pick this up. And as I said, your credibility will just go out that window. Believe you me. And let's take it a bit further. So, why is the time of the year important? Very, very simple. Is your story set in winter? Is it set in summer? Is it autumn or spring? Because if you are describing the weather, then and your story is in winter, and you flipped and you forgot it's in winter, and you said it's a hot day, that's not working out. So you need to be remembering what time of the year your story is set in. And also, so say for example, is it set in winter, summer, autumn or spring? And remember the seasons, and that is important, the seasons as well, because the seasons in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere are in reverse. So, for example, in the northern hemisphere, when it's winter here, in the southern hemisphere, it's summer. In the northern hemisphere, when it's spring here, it's autumn in the southern hemisphere. So if you've got, say, for example, your story is set in August, June or July, and you've got your storyline, your character set in the northern hemisphere, then yes, those months are probably going to be warm and summer days. But if your character is set and your story is set in the southern hemisphere, say like in New Zealand, and you are in the months of June, July or August, well, it's their winter months. So you can still have the months, but you've got to reverse the weather because it's going to be cold. And in South Island in New Zealand, there'll be snow on the mountains. They'll be doing skiing. It's dark nights. It's cold. So do you see why, you've got to get the time of the year right, where your country is, what is the weather like there? It's all important because when you talk about it in your stories, it's got to be accurate. Think about it. So, the really big message is here. So the more you research and the more you think about your scene, you think about your plot, then the more your reader will enjoy your story, will respect that you've done all the research and that your story is credible. That is the most important word. Your story is credible. Let's move on. So I've moved on from where I have the diagram down here, country, topography, weather, time of the year, era. I'm moving on to the other side. I had over here the region, and I had the area, and I had the town and the city and the village on this side here. Because now you're getting down into the nitty-gritty, and you need to go a little bit further. So, where have you set the plot? So, is it a large area? Is it a large region? Is it a large city? Is it a large town? Is it a big village? Is it a small village? All these things you need to go and look at and research because, again, you need to get your facts right. No point in saying you named the village and said it was a large village when, in actual fact, it was a town, but it was a small town. So you need to be realistic. Go on Google Earth to have a look, or if you visit the place and you record it, then draw on your own experiences and your knowledge. But again, go back onto the satellite apps and just check your information. Go and have a look. Just make sure you're right. And with the apps, you see, you can go down the streets. You can click the streets, and the images will take you down the streets. So you can then go and have a look at the houses on either side, what's there, what do the schools look like, what colour bricks have they got, what do they look like? Are they flat? Are they tall buildings? Are they round? Are they square? Or all these things. Where's the cafe? Is there a school there? Is there a church there? Where is it in relation to each other? You can have a look, and then when you've done that, you've had a look, you can then put that in the story. So this is you really going down the line to the nitty-gritty of the details. What are people's gardens like? What would it be in where you put the plot and the storyline and your character? And believe you me, your readers will check you out. Not everyone will pick it up, but some bright spot will spot it and send you a message saying, that's not right. And when you look at it, you're thinking, that wasn't right. So it doesn't look good. And I said to you, about era. So you need to say, well, what era are you writing? What century are you writing in? So are you writing now, in the present, or are you writing about a story in the past? And if you're writing in the past, then you've got to remember that things were different in those days. They didn't have maybe the internet. They didn't have smartphones, or they didn't have designer gear. They didn't have these things. So if you are, say, talking about in the beginning of the 20th century, there was no internet, there was none of that sort of stuff, no smartphones, and you then go and you say, your character texts a message to his friend. There was no text messages around then. So do you see how important it is? Once you know the era that you're writing in, you need to know all about that era, what was about, so you can use that. It would be a telephone, or they would have telephoned, or they would have written a letter to their friends, or they would have gone round and knocked on the door. See what I'm getting at? And of course, if you're talking about now, in the 21st century, 2021, 2020, and if you said, the character sent a letter to their friends, well, they wouldn't. They'd send a text, send a message. They'd be on their smartphone shouting down it. Or they'd be sending pictures, images. And they'd be talking about Skype, they'd be talking about Zoom, they'd be talking about all sorts of different things. So when you pick the era, you need to have a look at what was around at that time. See what? And you might be thinking, well, all these things are, I just want to write a story. But you've got to get the facts right. You've got to get the plot right, the scene right. You've got to get this right. So, let's see how this all fits in with my Icelandic boy. Let's have a look. Let's put the bones onto the plot. Let's get going. And then later on we'll put the flesh on. That comes on the next session. So, here we have Alderwood, my Icelandic boy. There's Alderwood, layer 1, main character. Here's Haldor, Vanna, layer 2, remember, sub-characters. And here's layer 3. They are the floating characters. Remember I said they go in and out, these characters do. They're there just to support the storyline as you go through your story. They're the floating characters. So now we're going to the plot. So let's start with the scenery. So, country. I chose Iceland. It's in the northern hemisphere. It's the time of the year that I've chosen is early spring. And the year is 2018. And you might be thinking, what's that got to do with 2018? Well, if you remember on the attributes to the character, I gave him a smartphone and it was an iPhone 8. Now, if I said, the year was 2017, that would have been wrong because the iPhone 8 came out in 2018. So it came out late 2017, but remember my story is set in the spring. So it's the spring of 2018. So if I had said that it was spring, but it's 2016, and I'd said, the iPhone 8, it wasn't about. So it would have been the iPhone 7 probably. So you see how important the little minute details are. It all pinpoints to your research, and you've got to do this. So that's why the era is important. And the time of the year, again, because when you look at my character, remember he had a black duffel coat. He was wrapped up in jumpers, scarves, boots, warm trousers, because in Iceland it's cold at that time of year, and the temperature's probably at about 1 degree centigrade, and there's snow around. In their summer, he'd be in t-shirts, it'd be a little lot warmer. So, the time of the year I put is April to March. That's the time of the year. Topography. Iceland has deep fjords. It has volcanic deserts. It has black sand beaches. It has snow-capped mountains. And it has staggering waterfalls. So I can put all this into the story because it's realistic. It's sparsely populated. So there's no point in saying Iceland, characters in the country, there was 50 million Icelandic people. There isn't. It's sparsely populated. And the weather. So for that time of the year, the temperature I've checked is about 1 degree centigrade. There'll be snow around. There'll be sleet around. And there could also be the possibility of the northern lights still showing. that spectacular show of all the greens and the purples at night time that light up the sky, which lots of people go and see and visit the place for. That's why a lot of people go to Iceland and go to see the Northern Lights. They are spectacular, believe me. And, there are ice caves around. So, where I put the character, you'll see what's the weather going to be like? What's the topography around there? What are the streets like? You need to do your research and go and have a look. Then you can talk about it. So, there you are. And now, where did I put him in Iceland? Well, in the region, I put him in the northwest. I put him in a small fishing town called Stykkishólmur. Stykkishólmur. It's a small fishing community on the coastline in the northwest region of Iceland. That's where the story is. That's where the character comes from. Population is only around about just under 1,200 people. So it's very sparse. There's not many people there. It's a fishing community. It has a small harbour. It's got a school. The houses are coloured, brightly coloured in blue, yellow and red. And they're, generally speaking, they are wood clad. So, all this I found out by going on Google Earth map, because I've never been to Iceland. So you can see how I've done my research. So when I write the story, all this will reflect all the research that I've done. Next week, I'm going to do the next section of the plot. Remember, I said there were two sections, one the scenery, and then section 2 is the actual storyline itself. So that's what I'm going to do next week. But can you see how important all your homework and research is? Building up the character, building up the plot, all to give the reader the impression that you've done your research and that this story is realistic and it's credible. Now, if your story is fantasy and it's made in a made-up land and it's totally fictional, then yeah, you can be a little bit more creative, but I'm not. I put my characters in specific places, I talk about those places, and I want to make my stories realistic. That's why these are the formulas that I use to create my stories. So until next week, when I take you to the section 2 of how I do the plot, I simply say, stay safe. See you then.
Thanks for listening to The Smart Kids. Want to follow more of their adventures? Check out The Smart Kids by J.T. Crowley on Amazon.com now.